Welcome again to 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And this week we're on Thing 11. My name is Reverend John Borthwick, and I've been continuing with my congregation through a virtual pilgrimage of Bob Joseph's book, The 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. It's been a fascinating journey, and today we're on number 11. And number 11 is restricted Indians from leaving their reserve without permission from an Indian agent. Now, this was something that was imposed in 1885, all the way until, again, 1951, which is similar to the number 10 that we talked about last time. Now, the way it's phrased is that while this legislation existed, it wasn't really legislation, I guess would be the best way to technically speak of it. It was more of a policy that was kind of created and sometimes used and sometimes not, but it certainly was practiced. You see, the concern, as I understand it, was after the Red River Rebellion, there was concerns that indigenous people who were desiring to get armed, were maybe militant, were maybe seeking more kinds of opportunities for open rebellion, and we can maybe imagine the reasons behind much of that. The concern was that we needed to make sure we knew where indigenous people were going, understood where, gave them permission to leave, things like that. Now, taking that in, we might just go, well, that seems normal or rational or an appropriate thing to do. But can you imagine your movements being restricted based solely on your race, your ethnicity, and nothing more? Your restrictions, your life being restricted to living in a space that you perhaps didn't want to live in the first place, but the government told you had to live there on a reserve, that you weren't allowed to live anywhere else. And then you were told, based on your race, that you had to get permission if you wanted to leave town, leave the reserve, from an Indian agent. You had to get a pass in order to leave. And you can imagine, of course, this is bureaucracy at its best. You can imagine, how some people might have abused, if you were the Indian agent, how you might have abused that kind of policy, that kind of ability to say, you need my permission in order to get off this reserve. But just on the first piece, can you imagine being restricted from where you go and what you do in Canada based solely on your race, based solely on your ethnicity? Now, throughout global history, we've seen many situations just like this. But we have this picture in our heads that Canada is somehow different. And the Act tells us that Canada isn't any different, and hasn't been any different, really, and has had policies that have restricted the ability for individual human beings to be able to do what they might want to do without having to answer to someone else. So this pass system was certainly something that existed. It was certainly something that was expanded over time. It was a way of controlling the movements of indigenous persons. Now here's one of the more tragic pieces that Bob offers at the end of this particular chapter. And it relates to residential schools. And interestingly enough, the next thing is the creation of the residential schools. Number 12, we'll get to that next week. But he states this, and I'm just going to read it and offer it as something for us to reflect on, most of us having the knowledge we have now of residential school system. Beginning in 1889, parents required passes to visit their children interned at residential schools. Controlling parents' access to their children aided and abetted the government's policy of keeping the family and their influence distanced from their children. Agents were encouraged to only provide a pass to parents to visit their children in school no more frequently than 4 times a year. If a child was ill, and the residential school shared this information with the child's parents, additional passes may be issued. Your children are taken by the government to a residential school. As parents, you're allowed maybe to visit them if the Indian agent approves a pass no more than 4 times a year. And if your child was sick, if you were informed, which we know was not the case in the history of residential schools all the time, you might get a chance to visit them again. Can you imagine living under those conditions, living in that kind of world? And what kind of generational impact that would have on you as a people, as a family, living into the next generations and beyond. These are things to think about and reflect upon as we read the book, 21 Things That You May Not Know About the Indian Act. We've read 11 of them. There's 10 more to go. Thank you so much for joining me.